The bustling streets of Chicago were alive with the usual lunchtime rush. Office workers hurried past food carts, the smell of hot dogs and pretzels mixing with car exhaust and the crisp autumn air. Among them was James Chen, a young investment banker who'd barely looked up from his phone all morning. At 23, James had everything figured out, or so he thought. His designer suit fit perfectly, his leather shoes gleamed, and his career was right on track. He'd graduated top of his class, landed a job at Preston and Brooks investment firm, and was already turning heads with his market analysis skills. His mom loved telling her friends how her son was making it big in the city. That Tuesday started like any other. James had just finished a meeting with clients and was heading to grab his usual turkey sandwich from the deli around the corner. He was mentally rehearsing his afternoon presentation, barely noticing the people around him, when Ray's voices cut through his thoughts. Outside Lee's convenience store, a scene was unfolding. A pregnant woman, clearly in her third trimester, was backing away from a man who kept stepping into her space. She held her purse close, one hand protectively over her belly. The look of fear in her eyes made James's stomach turn. The aggressive man, dressed in dirty jeans and a stained jacket, was getting louder. "You think you're better than me? Huh? Can't even look at me when I'm talking to you." Other people on the street were doing what city folks do best, hurrying past, pretending not to notice, some crossing to the other side. James felt his heart pounding. Every instinct told him to walk on, to mind his own business like everyone else. He had that important presentation in 2 hours. He couldn't afford to get involved in some street drama, but his feet wouldn't move. He remembered his grandfather's words from years ago. "Son, there are moments in life that define who you are. They come without warning, and what you do in those moments, that's your character speaking." His grandfather, who'd worked as a store clerk for 40 years, never walked away from someone in need. The woman was now pressed against the store window, her voice shaking as she said, "Please, just leave me alone." The man took another step forward, and something in James snapped. Before he could think it through, he was moving toward them. His hands were trembling, but his voice came out steady. "Hey," he called out, positioning himself between the woman and her harasser. "Is there a problem here?" He could smell alcohol in the man's breath, could see the wild look in his bloodshot eyes. Up close, the situation felt even more dangerous. James had never been in a fight in his life. His biggest confrontations had been over spreadsheet errors. But standing there, seeing the grateful relief in the woman's eyes, he knew he couldn't back down. The next few minutes passed in a blur. James kept his voice calm, repeating phrases like, "Let's all take a breath, and nobody needs trouble here." A small crowd had gathered, and finally, a store employee came out. The aggressive man, now outnumbered, backed off with a stream of ugly words that made James's ears burn. When it was over, James found himself shaking. The woman, catching her breath, introduced herself as Mrs. Taylor. She was a lawyer, she explained, who'd been getting lunch when the man started following her. "You didn't have to step in," she said, "but you did. These days, that means something." Looking at his phone, James realized he probably missed getting his sandwich. His afternoon presentation would have to be delivered on an empty stomach. But somehow that didn't seem important anymore. Something had shifted inside him, like a door opening to a room he hadn't known was there. As Mrs. Taylor's husband pulled up in their car, having rushed over after her call, James watched them drive away. He straightened his tie, ready to head back to his office. But he knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of something much bigger than a simple act of intervention on a Chicago street. Word spread quickly through the office about what James had done. By the time he got back, his coworkers were already talking about it. Someone had recorded the whole thing on their phone, and now the video was making rounds on social media. James felt uncomfortable with all the attention. He'd just done what felt right at the moment. The next morning, his phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It was Mrs. Taylor, asking if they could meet for coffee. She'd gotten his contact information from the business card he'd given her husband. James agreed, choosing a quiet cafe near his office for lunch. When he arrived at Bean and Brew, Mrs. Taylor was already there, sitting at a corner table. She looked different now, composed and professional in a navy blue suit, quite a change from the frightened woman he'd met yesterday. She stood up to greet him, her smile warm and genuine. "I wanted to thank you properly," she said as they sat down. "You know, I've been practicing law for 15 years, dealing with all kinds of difficult situations. But yesterday," she paused, touching her belly gently. "Yesterday scared me, and what scared me more was how many people just walked by." James stirred his coffee, not sure what to say. "Anyone would have done the same thing," he mumbled, but Mrs. Taylor shook her head. "No, they wouldn't. And they didn't. That's exactly why I wanted to talk to you." She leaned forward slightly. "I work with the Community Justice Center. We handle civil rights cases, discrimination suits, community advocacy. Yesterday showed me something about your character that's rare these days, the willingness to step up when it matters." As they talked, James found himself opening up about his own life. He told her about growing up in a middle-class neighborhood, about his parents who'd worked so hard to give him opportunities, about his grandfather who taught him about standing up for what's right. Mrs. Taylor listened intently, occasionally sharing her own experiences. "You know," she said, "we're always looking for people with financial expertise. Many of our clients need help understanding their options, dealing with predatory lending, managing settlements. Would you be interested in volunteering some time?" The old James would have politely declined, citing his busy schedule and career obligations. But something had changed since yesterday. "I'd like that," he heard himself say. "I'd like that a lot." As they were finishing up, the cafe door opened and a tall man in a pressed suit walked in, Mr. Taylor. He'd come to join them, and the three spent another hour talking about the community center's work. James learned about families fighting foreclosure, small business owners struggling with unfair practices, and young people trying to break cycles of poverty. "Most people think making a difference means doing something huge," Mr. Taylor explained, his voice deep and thoughtful. "But real change happens in small moments, when one person decides to do what's right instead of what's easy." Walking back to his office, James felt different. The familiar streets of Chicago seemed to tell different stories now. He noticed things he'd overlooked before: the elderly woman struggling with grocery bags, the young man in a wheelchair trying to navigate a broken sidewalk, the street vendor getting hassled by some teenagers. His phone buzzed again. His boss wanted to see him. The video had reached the upper management, and they were concerned about the firm's image. James straightened his tie and took a deep breath. He realized that yesterday's split-second decision to help a stranger was turning into something bigger, something that might test his comfortable world in ways he hadn't expected. But as he rode the elevator up to the executive floor, James felt surprisingly calm. His grandfather's words echoed in his mind again about moments that define character. Yesterday had been one of those moments, and today it might be another. Whatever came next, he knew he couldn't go back to being the person who walked past problems, pretending not to see. The meeting with his boss hadn't gone quite as James expected. Mr. Richardson, a stern man in his 50s, sat behind his mahogany desk, the viral video playing on his computer screen. "You've put us in an interesting position, Chen," he said, leaning back in his chair. "The board is concerned." James felt his stomach tighten. "Concerned, sir? About me helping someone?" "About image, Chen. About association. We handle millions in investments. Our clients expect discretion, not viral videos." Mr. Richardson tapped his fingers on the desk. "The woman you helped. She's involved in some controversial cases against major corporations, some of whom might be our future clients." The words hung in the air like heavy smoke. James thought about his career path, about the promotion he'd been working toward. Then he thought about Mrs. Taylor's face when he'd stepped in to help her, about the conversations at the coffee shop, about his grandfather's wisdom. "Sir," James said carefully, "I understand the concern, but I can't apologize for helping someone in need. It's what my parents taught me, what this country is supposed to stand for." The next few days were strange. Some colleagues avoided him in the hallways, while others quietly approached to express support. The video had gained more attention, and local news stations were reaching out for interviews. James declined them all, focusing instead on his work and his new volunteer commitment at the Community Justice Center. His first Saturday at the center opened his eyes to a world he'd only seen in statistics. He met a retired teacher who'd lost his pension to a scam, a single mother fighting to keep her small bakery open, a group of high school students who wanted to start a community business but couldn't get loans. James found himself using his financial knowledge in ways he never had before. He explained complex terms in simple language, helped people understand their rights, and showed them how to protect themselves from predatory practices. It felt different from his work at the firm, more real, more immediate. One evening, as he was leaving the center, he ran into Mrs. Taylor again. She was working late, reviewing cases. "You know," she said, looking up from her files, "when my husband and I first started this center, people said it wouldn't work, said you can't fight big money with small resources. But they forgot about people like you, James, people who bring their skills and hearts to help others." That night, walking home, James called his grandfather. The old man listened as James poured out his thoughts about work, about the center, about feeling pulled in different directions. "Sounds to me like you're waking up, son," his grandfather said softly. "Sometimes life shakes us until we open our eyes. The question is, what do we do once we're awake?" The next morning, James arrived early at his office. He had a quiet breakfast at his desk, watching the city wake up through his window. His phone buzzed with a text from the center. Another family needed help understanding their mortgage terms. His inbox held emails from clients worth millions, waiting for his analysis. He thought about Mr. Richardson's words about image and association. He thought about the retired teacher's grateful smile when James helped him recover some of his lost money. He thought about his comfortable salary, his career plans, his idea of success. The sun rose higher over Chicago's skyline, lighting up the glass towers where decisions about money and power were made every day. James opened his laptop, beginning his morning routine, but something had shifted inside him. The numbers on his screen weren't just figures anymore. They represented real people, real lives. He realized that his chance encounter with Mrs. Taylor hadn't just changed his schedule or added volunteer work to his weekends. It had changed how he saw everything: his job, his city, his role in the world. The young banker who'd walked past problems his whole life was becoming someone new, someone who stopped, who looked, who helped. 1 month after the incident, James sat in another meeting with Mr. Richardson, but this time it was different. The older man wasn't alone. 2 board members sat with him, their faces serious. The viral video had grown into something bigger. News channels had picked up the story, and now James was being called the Wall Street Guardian Angel on social media. "We've received calls from several major clients," Mr. Richardson said, his voice carefully neutral. "They're expressing concerns about your involvement with the Community Justice Center. One of them specifically mentioned a case the center is building against their subsidiary company." James felt a familiar knot in his stomach, but it wasn't fear this time. It was frustration. "The center helps people who have nowhere else to turn," he said quietly. "Last week, I helped an elderly couple save their home from a fraudulent loan scheme. Is that really bad for our image?" One of the board members, a woman with steel gray hair, leaned forward. "Mr. Chen, your work here has been exceptional. But we need to know where your loyalties lie. The center is becoming increasingly vocal about corporate practices. Some of these practices involve our clients. The choice they were asking him to make hung in the air, unspoken but clear. James looked out the window at the city below, remembering his grandfather's words about waking up. He was definitely awake now, and he couldn't pretend not to see what was in front of him. That evening, instead of heading home, James went to the center. The place was busy, as usual. A group of small business owners was meeting in one room, learning about protecting their rights. In another, volunteers were helping families fill out paperwork for housing assistance. Mrs. Taylor was there, looking tired but determined despite her advancing pregnancy. She was on the phone, discussing a case with someone. When she saw James, she quickly wrapped up her call. "You look like you've had quite a day," she said, gesturing to a chair. James told her about the meeting, about the pressure, about the choice he was facing. As he talked, he noticed a young girl watching her mother fill out forms, clutching a worn teddy bear. The mother looked worried, but when a volunteer explained something, her face lit up with hope. "You know," Mrs. Taylor said, following his gaze, "every person who comes through that door has a story. They're not just cases or numbers. They're people who believed in the system, who played by the rules, and who got hurt anyway. They need people like you, James, people who understand both worlds." The next day, James did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He walked into Mr. Richardson's office early in the morning and placed a letter on his desk. His hands weren't shaking anymore. "I can't work for clients who hurt people and expect me to look the other way," he said simply. "I'm grateful for everything I've learned here, but I need to use those lessons differently now." Mr. Richardson looked at the resignation letter, then at James. For a moment, his stern expression softened. "You know," he said, "I was young once too, full of ideals. Life has a way of making you practical." "Maybe," James replied, "but life also has a way of showing you what really matters. Being practical isn't always being right." As he packed up his desk, colleagues stopped by. Some thought he was crazy for giving up such a promising career. Others quietly admired his courage. His phone buzzed with a message from his mother. She'd heard the news and wanted to talk. Walking out of the building that had been his professional home, James felt lighter. His future was uncertain now, his carefully planned career path abandoned. But when he thought about the people at the center, the worried mothers, the struggling business owners, the elderly couples fighting to keep their homes, he knew he'd made the right choice. The city streets seemed different now. The same buildings towered overhead, but they didn't intimidate him anymore. He was seeing Chicago through new eyes, not as a place of endless ambition and competition, but as a community where people's lives intertwined, where small acts of courage could ripple out in unexpected ways. The conversation with his mother went exactly as James expected. She was worried, confused, and a little angry. "All those years of education," she said over dinner at their family home. "Your father and I worked so hard to give you opportunities, and now you're throwing it all away." James looked around the modest dining room where he'd grown up. Family photos lined the walls. His graduation, his parents' wedding, his grandfather in his store uniform. "Mom, do you remember what Dad always said about success?" His mother paused, chopsticks halfway to her mouth. His father had passed away 5 years ago, but his words still echoed in their home. "He said success isn't what you have, it's what you do with it," she replied softly. "Exactly. I'm not throwing anything away. I'm using everything you and Dad gave me, my education, my skills, everything I learned at the firm. I'm just using it to help people who really need it." The next week, James started full-time at the Community Justice Center. The pay was less than half of what he'd made at the investment firm, but the work filled him with purpose. He transformed the center's financial counseling program, using his expertise to create simple guides that helped people understand complex financial products. One day, a familiar face walked through the door, Mr. Richardson's secretary from the firm. She looked uncomfortable being there, glancing around nervously. My brother, she explained quietly to James. He got caught in one of those payday loan cycles. I remembered how you helped that elderly couple. James spent 2 hours going through her brother's paperwork, explaining his options, helping him create a plan to get out of debt. When they finished, the secretary's brother had tears in his eyes. Nobody ever explained it like this before, he said. Everyone just made me feel stupid for getting into this mess. The center was getting busier. Word spread about the former investment banker who could speak both languages, the complex terms of high finance and the everyday language of regular people. Mrs. Taylor, now in her final month of pregnancy, watched with satisfaction as James' program grew. We need to expand this, she said one evening, rubbing her back tiredly. There are other neighborhoods, other communities that need these services. But we'd need funding, resources. James had been thinking about this too. He'd been making calls to his old college classmates, many of whom had done well in finance. Some were interested in helping, either with donations or volunteer time. A few even seemed envious of his new path. His grandfather visited the center one afternoon, watching James work with a group of small business owners. The old man sat quietly in the back of the room, his eyes bright with pride. After the session, they walked to a nearby diner for coffee. "You know what I see when I watch you work?" His grandfather asked, stirring sugar into his cup. "I see your father." He had the same look when he was helping people at his clinic, like every person mattered, like their problems were his problems. James felt his throat tighten. His father had been a community doctor, working in neighborhoods where other doctors wouldn't go. He'd never made much money, but people still talked about his kindness years after his passing. That night, James sat at his small apartment desk, looking over the center's budget. His savings from the firm wouldn't last forever, and the center needed more resources to grow. But as he reviewed the day's cases, the single mom saving her house, the young couple avoiding bankruptcy, the elderly man protecting his pension, he knew he'd never go back to his old life. His phone lit up with a message from Mrs. Taylor's husband. She'd gone into labor early and was at the hospital. James sat back, remembering that day outside the convenience store. He'd just been trying to help one person in one moment. He never imagined it would lead him here, to a completely different life, to work that made his heart feel full. Outside his window, the city lights twinkled. Somewhere out there, other people were facing the same choice he'd faced, between comfort and conscience, between looking away and stepping up. He hoped they'd find the courage to choose what was right. At the hospital, James found Mr. Taylor pacing in the waiting room. The normally composed lawyer looked anxious, his tie loosened and his sleeves rolled up. When he saw James, he managed a tight smile. "There are complications," he said quietly. "The doctor says her blood pressure is too high." James sat with Mr. Taylor, listening as he shared his worries. The conversation turned to how they'd met. Mrs. Taylor had been defending a community health clinic that was being forced to close. "That's when I knew she was special," Mr. Taylor said. "She fought for 3 days straight, barely slept, because those people needed that clinic." Hours passed. Other families came and went, their own dramas playing out in the fluorescent-lit waiting room. Around midnight, a nurse finally appeared with news. Both mother and baby were stable. It was a girl. Later, standing at the nursery window, James watched the tiny baby sleeping peacefully. Mrs. Taylor had asked him to be the godfather, a responsibility that felt both overwhelming and right. "She'll grow up in a world that's still not fair," Mr. Taylor said, standing beside him. "But people like you give me hope that it's getting better." The next few weeks brought big changes at the center. News of their financial literacy program had spread, and more people were showing up every day. James's phone kept ringing with calls from his old world. Former colleagues who wanted to volunteer, clients who were interested in supporting their work. One morning, a surprise visitor arrived. It was the gray-haired board member from his old firm. She looked around the busy center with curious eyes. "I've been watching what you're doing here," she said. "It's not what I expected." James showed her around, introducing her to the volunteers and some of the people they helped. In the conference room, a teenage girl was explaining her plan for a small catering business to one of James's volunteer financial advisors. Her mother had lost her job, and the girl wanted to help support her family. The board members stopped to listen. The girl's passion was clear as she laid out her ideas, her market research, her careful calculations. The volunteer was helping her refine her business plan, teaching her about pricing and overhead costs. "You're not just giving handouts," the board members said thoughtfully. "You're teaching people to build something sustainable." "That's right," James replied. "Everyone who comes here has dreams, skills, and potential. Sometimes they just need someone to believe in them and show them the path forward." That evening, after most people had left, James sat with Mrs. Taylor in her office. She'd returned from maternity leave, her baby daughter sleeping peacefully in a carrier beside her desk. They were discussing a new challenge. A large developer was buying up properties in a low-income neighborhood, forcing longtime residents out. "We need to think bigger," Mrs. Taylor said, gently rocking the carrier with her foot. "These aren't just individual cases anymore. We need to change the system itself." James nodded, thinking about his conversation with the board member. "Maybe," he said slowly, "we can build bridges between both worlds. Use the knowledge from one to protect the other." He thought about his father again, about how he'd focused on treating patients, but also fought to improve the healthcare system itself. Change happened both ways, helping individuals while working to fix the bigger picture. Walking home that night, James passed the convenience store where everything had started. The same clerk was behind the counter, and he waved in recognition. So much had changed since that day, yet the core truth remained the same. Every moment offered a choice between walking past or stepping up. His phone buzzed with a text from his mother. She'd finally visited the center that day, watching him work with a group of senior citizens who'd been targeted by investment scams. "Now I understand," she wrote. "Your father would be so proud." James looked up at the city skyline, at the mix of old buildings and gleaming towers. Somewhere in those towers, his former colleagues were still moving millions with keystrokes. But down here, on the streets, he was helping move lives forward, one person at a time. It wasn't the success he'd planned for, but it was the one that let him sleep peacefully at night. The developer issue had grown into something bigger than anyone at the center expected. Families who had lived in their homes for generations were getting eviction notices. Small businesses that had served the community for decades were being priced out. The neighborhood was fighting back, but they were up against big money and clever lawyers. James sat in a community meeting at the local church, listening to people share their stories. An elderly man stood up, his voice shaking. "I raised my children in that house. My wife passed away there. Now they're telling me I have to leave because someone wants to build luxury condos." The room was packed. Residents, small business owners, community leaders. Mrs. Taylor sat beside James, her baby daughter sleeping against her chest in a carrier. She'd been working late nights on this case, determined to find a way to protect the community. "What they're doing isn't illegal," she'd explained to James earlier, "but it's wrong. We need to find a different approach." That's when James had an idea. He'd spent years learning how big money worked, how developers thought, what made investors nervous. Maybe it was time to use that knowledge differently. He started digging into the developer's financial structure. Working late into the night, he discovered they'd used a complex web of shell companies and questionable loans. It wasn't illegal, but it was risky, the kind of risk that made investors uncomfortable. One evening, while reviewing documents, James got an unexpected call. It was his old boss, Mr. Richardson. "I heard you're looking into United Development Partners," he said. "Be careful, Chen. They have powerful friends." But James wasn't afraid anymore. He'd learned that courage wasn't about not feeling fear. It was about doing what's right despite being afraid. He gathered evidence, built relationships with sympathetic journalists, and worked with the community to organize peaceful protests. The teenage girl from the catering business brought food to their planning meetings. Her business was growing, thanks to the center's help, and she wanted to give back. "You helped my family," she told James. "Now I want to help other families keep their homes." The pressure began to build. Local news stations picked up the story. Photos of elderly residents facing eviction appeared on social media. James used his financial expertise to explain to reporters exactly how the development scheme worked, making complex transactions understandable to everyday people. Then came a breakthrough. One of James's former clients, a major investment firm, saw the news coverage and got worried. They were indirect investors in the development project, and they didn't like the negative attention. They called James for a meeting. In a quiet coffee shop, James laid out the facts to his former client. He wasn't there to threaten or expose. He just wanted them to understand the real cost of their investment. "These aren't just properties," he explained. "They're people's lives, their histories, their communities." The investment firm representative, a woman who'd known James from his banking days, listened carefully. "You've changed," she said finally, "but maybe we need to change too." Within weeks, the development project was suspended. The firm pulled their funding, forcing the developers to reconsider their plans. It wasn't a complete victory. The neighborhood still faced challenges, but it was a start. At the center, they celebrated with a community dinner. The teenage caterer provided the food, local musicians played, and children ran around the tables. James watched Mrs. Taylor's baby girl being passed from person to person, everyone wanting to hold her. His grandfather showed up, bringing his famous homemade dumplings. "You know what I see here?" he asked James, gesturing at the celebrating crowd. "I see power. Not the kind that comes from money, but the kind that comes from people standing together." Later that night, James walked through the neighborhood that had nearly been lost. Lights glowed in windows where families were still in their homes. The old corner store was still open, its owner chatting with customers. A group of kids played basketball in the community court. He thought about how one moment outside a convenience store had led him here. How choosing to step up once had shown him a different way to live. His phone buzzed. Another case needed attention. Another community needed help. James smiled, turned toward home, and began planning his next move. 1 year had passed since the day James stepped between a scared pregnant woman and her harasser. The Community Justice Center had grown, moving to a larger space that could handle the increasing number of people seeking help. More importantly, they'd started teaching other communities how to build similar programs. On a bright spring morning, James stood before a room full of business students at his old university. The professor, his former mentor, had invited him to speak about ethical finance and community development. The students looked just like he had a few years ago, eager, ambitious, dressed in their best business attire. "Let me tell you about real wealth," James began. "It's not just the numbers in your bank account. It's the grandmother who gets to keep her house. It's the small business owner who can pay for his daughter's college. It's the community that stands together and grows stronger." After the lecture, a young student approached him. She reminded him of himself, same determined look, same carefully pressed suit. "But how do you make a living?" she asked. "The money must be so much less than in banking." James smiled. "I have everything I need," he said, "and something I never had in banking. The feeling that my work makes the world a little better every day." Back at the center, a new challenge was brewing. The success of their financial literacy program had caught attention. Big banks were starting to offer similar services, but with hidden fees and complicated terms. They were using the language of community help to mask old practices. Mrs. Taylor, watching her daughter take her first steps in the center's playroom, shook her head at the news. "They're trying to copy what we do, but without the heart," she said. "We need to show people the difference." That evening, James worked late with a group of volunteers, developing a guide to help people spot the difference between genuine community programs and corporate imitations. The teenage caterer, now running a successful small business, brought them dinner. "You know what's funny?" she said, setting down trays of food. "When I first came here, I thought I just needed money advice. But you all taught me about community, about helping others while helping yourself." James's phone rang. It was the investment firm that had pulled out a development project. They wanted to discuss something bigger. Their board had been watching the center's work, seeing the positive changes in communities. They wanted to create a genuine community investment fund, with James as an advisor. "We're not asking you to come back to banking," the representative explained. "We want to learn from what you're doing. Maybe there's a way to make profit and make a difference." The next day, James discussed the offer with Mrs. Taylor and her husband. The baby girl crawled around their feet, playing with paper clips. "It's risky," Mrs. Taylor said. "They could be trying to co-opt what we do." Or, her husband added, "It could be a chance to change things from the inside. Imagine if we could influence how big money gets invested in communities." James thought about his journey. He'd learned that real change didn't always mean fighting against the system. Sometimes it meant showing the system a better way. He thought about all the communities that could benefit if investment firms started thinking differently about profit and purpose. His grandfather dropped by that afternoon, as he often did now. They sat in James's small office, sharing tea. "You're not the same person who helped that pregnant lady a year ago," the old man observed. "You're stronger now. Wiser." "I was just trying to help one person," James said. "I never imagined where it would lead." His grandfather nodded. "That's how big changes start. One person helps another. Then those two help two more. Soon you have a movement." Outside, the city was changing. Not just physically, with buildings and developments, but in smaller, more important ways. Communities were getting stronger. People were learning to stand together. The center's success was inspiring similar programs in other neighborhoods, other cities. James looked at the photo on his desk, the center's team with the community members they'd helped. Different faces, different stories, all connected by the simple truth he'd learned that day outside the convenience store. When one person chooses to help, it creates ripples that touch countless lives. 5 years had passed. The Community Justice Center had become a model for similar programs across the country. James stood at the window of their new building, watching people arrive for the center's anniversary celebration. The small operation that once helped a few dozen people had grown into a movement that touched thousands of lives. Mrs. Taylor's daughter, now a lively 5-year-old, ran through the hallway, her footsteps echoing against the walls. She was wearing a tiny business suit, insisting on dressing like the grown-ups for the special day. "Uncle James," she called out, hugging his legs. "Mommy says you're going to tell the story again." The main room was packed with faces both familiar and new. The elderly man who'd kept his house sat next to the teenage caterer, who now owned a successful catering company and trained other young entrepreneurs. Mr. Richardson, James's former boss, was there too. He retired from the investment firm and now volunteered as a financial advisor. James's mother sat in the front row, beaming with pride. After his father's passing, she'd been worried about James throwing away his banking career. Now she volunteered at the center 3 days a week, helping other parents understand how to secure their children's financial futures. As James stepped up to the podium, he saw his grandfather in the audience, older now but still sharp-eyed and wise. The old man nodded encouragingly, just as he had done throughout James's life. 5 years ago, James began, "I was just another banker in a hurry, focused on my own success. Then one day, outside a convenience store, I saw someone who needed help. That moment changed everything. Not because I did anything special, but because it opened my eyes to what really matters." He looked around the room at all the lives that had become intertwined with his. We've learned so much since then. We've learned that real change happens when people stop walking past problems and start facing them together. We've learned that every person has something to give, something to teach. The investment fund they'd helped create had transformed how businesses invested in communities. Instead of pushing people out, they were helping people build. The old neighborhood that had nearly been lost to developers was thriving now, with new businesses owned by local residents and affordable housing that kept families together. Mrs. Taylor stepped up to share her part of the story, her daughter holding her hand. "When that man harassed me outside the store, I was scared," she said. "Not just for myself, but for the world my baby would be born into." But then a stranger stepped up, and that one act of courage sparked something bigger than any of us imagined. The teenage caterer, now a successful business owner, spoke next, describing how the center had helped her family move from crisis to stability. "But it wasn't just about the money advice," she said. "They showed us we weren't alone, that our community was stronger together." As the ceremony continued, James thought about all the moments that had led here. The scary conversations with his boss, the late nights working on difficult cases, the small victories, and hard lessons. Each step had seemed small at the time, but together they'd created a path to real change. His grandfather joined him at the window later, both of them watching the sun set over the city. "You know what I'm most proud of?" the old man said. "Not the awards or the programs or even all the people you've helped. I'm proud that you showed others how to be brave, how to stand up, how to care." Mrs. Taylor's daughter tugged at James's sleeve, asking to be picked up. As he lifted her, he remembered that day 5 years ago, how he'd almost walked past, almost stayed in his comfortable bubble. Looking at her face, the future he'd helped protect. He knew that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest choices. Outside, the city was alive with possibility. In offices and stores and homes across Chicago, people faced the same choice he faced that day: to walk past or to stop, to look away or to help. Thanks to the center's work, more of them were choosing to stop, to help, to care. The story wasn't over. It was still being written, one choice at a time, one person at a time, one day at a time. And somewhere out there, another moment was waiting, another chance for someone to step up and start their own journey of change.